A mid-90s cyberpunk reinterpretation of a decades-old pulp comic book hero that's proving eerily relevant to our modern times? Well, that's just peachy. It was back in 1994 that the classic comic book hero, the Phantom, would get a futuristic reinvention on Saturday morning as the cartoon series Phantom 2040. And it's just kind of crazy to look back at this series and see how it kind of ties into some of the things that we're dealing with in our society today. Now, I won't knock you for not being familiar with Phantom 2040. It did come out at a time when the animated landscape was very oversaturated, especially in terms of syndicated programming, and it's fair to say that it just kind of got lost in the shuffle. And it never really had killer ratings anyway to kind of pierce through everything else that was being put out. I was definitely a fan of this series, especially given the cyberpunk edge that would definitely break into the mainstream with the release of movies like Ghost in the Shell, as well as anime fans who had already discovered Akira back in 1988. And I have to say, for a character that was created before even Batman or Superman, it's just interesting to see that television producers were willing to give this character such a bold reinvention. For those who came in late, the Phantom was created in 1936 by Lee Falk for King Features Syndicate, and followed the exploits of a character who protected the jungles of the fictional African nation of Bengala. A legend spanning almost 500 years, the people of Bengala, whether they be good or bad, always believed the Phantom to be immortal, when in actuality the Phantom was a mantle passed down from generation unto generation, father unto father's son, so that the world would believe that there was only ever one. Now, there is at least one Phantom that was a woman, so you have to give the stewards of this family legacy some credit for being so progressive as to account for a time when there would be a Phantom that may have only been able to ever conceive daughters. So sometime in the 1500s, a freight ship was besieged by pirates, and though the ship's captain was killed, his son escaped and managed to get to the shores of Bengala and was raised by the local indigenous tribe. Years later, after he had been trained in their ways and came across his father's killer, the son decided to swear an oath on that pirate's skull to fight piracy and injustice in whatever form it would take. And that is metal AF. Now, the Phantom still appears in a variety of comics to this very day, as well as having had a series of movie serials throughout the 40s and 50s, as well as a feature-length film starring Billy Zane in 1996. If you check out nothing else with regard to the Phantom, at least see this, because that movie is fun as all hell. Just stay away from the 2009 pilot miniseries produced by the Sci-Fi Channel, where they had our man looking like a parkour armadillo. It is absolutely terrible. Phantom 2040, though, was something that was coming along at a time when animated shows were given a bit more leeway to have a more sophistication and themes and stories that were geared to slightly older audiences. You also had character designs from Peter Chung, who created Aeon Flux, as well as a star-studded voice cast that included the likes of Ron Perlman, Margot Kidder, Mark Hamill, Leah Remini. You even had guest appearances from Blondie frontwoman Deborah Harry. As for the character of the Phantom himself, that role would be voiced by Scott Valentine, who most people of a certain age might remember as the character of Nick from Family Ties. Taking place in the city-state of Metropia in the year 2040, the series follows college student Kit Walker Jr., who is kind of lamenting the state of the world as someone who loves nature and ecology, and it's just a shame because in this future, roughly 3/4 of wildlife around the planet has pretty much been wiped out. When a visitor to his and his aunt's home spurs on an attack from robots known as biots, Kit is led to discover a vast jungle underneath Metropia, where this visitor, who reveals himself to be his missing father's former partner, Guran, informs Kit that he is to follow in his father's footsteps and become the 24th Phantom. A big message pushed, at least in the first half of the series run of Phantom 2040, is the idea of the dangers of exhausting Earth's natural resources at the expense of its longevity. There's even a brief voiceover at the beginning of the first season's run of episodes that goes, "In the year 2040, one hero fights to save our dying planet, the Phantom." And this is something that, to its credit, is sort of interweaved throughout the series without feeling like a corporate or government mandate, as was kind of the trend back in the early to mid-90s as far as kids programming, which is why you had shows like Captain Planet and the Planeteers, for example. Ironically, the creation of this jungle was the result of a rare form of plant life from Bengala known as ghostwood that was bioengineered to feed on toxic materials. So when there was a toxic waste spill in the subway system of Metropia, the ghostwood was able to take root and create the ghost jungle. This event would also irrevocably change the lives of a handful of characters within the series, including Kit's father, who had gone missing after the calamity. Now, in terms of tying Phantom 2040 back to cyberpunk as a genre, it is important to acknowledge one of the fundamental elements of cyberpunk, which is the idea of high-tech, low life, and where we see the world has been kind of crippled by its over-reliance on technology. Cybernetic enhancements are more a curse than they are a blessing in certain aspects, and you have this ever-widening gap between the wealthy and the less fortunate, and so much of that kind of plays into what's happening in Phantom 2040 over the course of its 35-episode run. As society becomes more reliant on technology and further integrating it into our everyday lives, we see that there is a balance between ourselves and nature that is becoming unstable. And the corporations who have already more wealth and power than they could ever need are not only ambivalent to this dilemma, but they seem to be taking steps to hasten it. You look no further than AI data centers that are being built in areas of the country and the world where they know that those effects of draining so much energy and resources will have an adverse effect on lower working class minority communities. It's a feature, not a bug. So as this relates to Phantom 2040, you have the overarching villain of the series, Maximum Inc., led by the ruthless and categorically deranged Rebecca Madison. Maximum Inc. is one of the few remaining megacorporations to survive the resource wars, a time when megacorporations around the world fought in armed combat to control the last few remaining natural resources on the planet. There was no political subterfuge to mask this conflict. It was just a naked, unapologetic pursuit of anything that could be commodified by and for the top 1% in the world. Taking the reins of the company after her husband's untimely death, Rebecca has a plan to create a massive compound in Metropia called Cyberville. This will be a place where herself and an affluent few will be able to survive after she unleashes a toxin around the entire world that will kill all remaining life, leaving the planet clean for her to start the maximum era. A lot of the storylines in the first half of Phantom 2040 cover this development of Cyberville, especially as it relates to Maximum Inc.'s exploitation of the less fortunate members of Metropia's citizenry, especially scavengers who are just what they are. They scavenge technology and whatever they can find to kind of get by. And that relates heavily to one of the Phantom's allies, a 12-year-old Latino kid named Sparks. He is a hacker, he's very smart, very resourceful, and he was seemingly abandoned by his parents who were scavengers when he was a toddler. Or so he believed, as in one episode where he discovers that his parents were actually kidnapped by Maximum Inc. and experimented on so that their consciousness could be used to integrate into Cyberville's security system. This is easily one of the most heartbreaking episodes of the series, just because Sparks ultimately has to destroy the security system after encountering the ghost of his parents telling him that he needs to let them go. And it's just absolutely sad to watch because he had already lost his parents when he was younger, and now he has to lose them again by his own hand. This was a Saturday morning cartoon for children, people. But this wasn't stopping Phantom 2040 from exploring these heavier themes and ideas as it relates to science fiction and cyberpunk, especially when you look at things like the biots and cybernetic augmentation and virtual reality and artificial intelligence in general. You have one character, Heisenberg, who originally started as an experimental biot that was created by Rebecca Madison's son, who was meant to be an adversary for the Phantom, but his remote brain was damaged in their first encounter, resulting in him going on a search for his own independence, and eventually realizing that he could go to other biots and convince them to seek their own autonomy. And this was something that I thought was great in relation to the whole idea of a robot or a cybernetic individual having a sense of its own agency. And I think when we look at AI in our own world, we tend to think more on the Terminator side of things. And I appreciated that Phantom 2040 said, no, there is the potential for that, but there's also the potential for them just wanting to be their own individual consciousness. And I think that's something that the series handled very well. You also have the character of Graf, who is Rebecca Madison's chief of security within Maximum Inc. This character originally fought in the Resource Wars, and when a majority of his body was damaged, he had to have a cybernetic body grafted onto what remained. And Rebecca Madison makes it clear to him that that is company property, and should you ever get out of line, we'll take it back. Even more fascinating is the character of Dr. Jack, who is this shock jock reporter who is meant to be an extension of Maximum Inc.'s corporate control over the citizens of Metropia, where initially he is positioned as a character who only reports on the Phantom from a negative perspective, and his whole thing is that he will omit anything that shows the truth about what the Phantom is doing in Metropia. And one of the great things about this character, who is probably one of my favorite voice performances from Mark Hamill besides the Joker, is that in the past he was actually a overly principled, legitimate journalist. And when his wife was killed in that fateful toxic waste spill on the subway system of Metropia 16 years ago, he lost it. And He was desperate to find out the truth about the chemical that killed her and decided to go on the red market to get a surgery that would create an artificial intelligence probe using his own brain as a basis for that would seek out information online anywhere to find out what the chemical was. And unfortunately, the police force in Metropia, known as the Enforcers, interrupted the procedure, and the AI probe was lost in cyberspace, and it left Jack at least partially without his emotions or empathy, which made him perfect to be a sort of mouthpiece for the corporate interests, very much in the same vein of, say, Fox News. And fun fact about that AI probe, because that would become its own character over the course of Phantom 2040, it was actually voiced by Mark Hamill's fellow Batman the Animated Series voice actor, Paul Williams. It's kind of crazy to think that Phantom 2040 was dabbling into the idea of transhumanism, but here we are, and this is no more apparent than in the case of Maxwell Madison Sr., who originally had died 16 years prior in, you guessed it, that same toxic waste event that devastated a portion of the subway system in Metropia that created the Ghost Jungle. His brainwaves were preserved and uploaded into a computer hard drive that Rebecca Madison still communicates with, even though his responses are usually just wailings of movie quotes and show tunes. But it does bring up some interesting questions as to whether or not this is actually the real Maxwell Madison, and if so, what is that existence like, to be all thought and feeling with no physical body? And if this is just a facsimile that's digital and not really a person, then it just kind of makes Rebecca Madison a little bit more Fruit Loops than she already was. Neither option is particularly reassuring. On top of everything else, you have this other smaller level recurring villain by the name of Sean One, who is the first human being born in space. He represents orbital platforms that are seeking independence and believes that humanity has no chance of surviving on Earth, and he is very much committed to this goal, so to the point that he will hijack orbital platforms that have been weaponized or clone the hands of delegates who can vote for or against independence for those orbital platforms that he represents. He's very much in line with tech billionaires like Elon Musk, who think that humanity needs to colonize other planets before our sun turns into a red giant that will vaporize Earth in 5 billion years. All this is to say, it's just kind of crazy to look back at this show in particular from the 90s that was just produced to be another one of those kid shows that you watch on Saturday mornings, and realize now how relevant it is. Just if you look at the landscape of our world at the moment and just thinking to yourself, you know, we've been kind of ringing this bell about how corporations are dividing us and politicians are still their own separate issue, but it's less about them and more about the organizations that represent them, that have the most money, that have the most power, that are shaping the way we think and how we act and how we decide whether or not we're going to connect with people that are a little bit different from us but still have the same common issues that all tie back to these larger organizations. And it's just unfortunate thinking that 2040 as a year will be here before you know it. And Who knows if we have enough time to kind of steer the ship back in the right direction. This isn't to say that there weren't plenty of episodes of Phantom 2040 that were just downright weird and fun, because you did have one episode where Gran, overcome with guilt for not being with Kit's father at the time that he disappeared during the toxic waste event underneath Metropia 16 years prior, he internalizes that guilt so to the point that he turned into a literal panther. Yeah, that actually happened. Hey guys, thanks for watching as always. If you've got your own thoughts or opinions on Phantom 2040, if you've ever actually seen it, go ahead and leave a comment in the section below. Don't forget to hit the like button, hit the notification bell, share this video with your friends and family, and if you'd like to keep up to date on more at random videos, you can click the subscribe button right over here.